Hey all, some great news to share this week. We have passed the halfway point of the semester, so we are on the downslope. Just a few more weeks left to go, and these are going to be busy weeks. So let's go over a few things about the final projects to help make the next couple weeks easier. Your data sources table assignment has been graded. As with the research question, be sure to check the comments. I've left feedback on different components of your data sets or potential analyses you might want to follow. And also be sure to check in the projection, the projected coordinate system area. Many of you listed a projection system rather than a coordinate system. And for the final project and your analyses, you definitely need to be projecting that data into a projected coordinate system. So I've left some suggestions for those of you that didn't have one there. The next assignment is your flow chart. It can be a tricky part of the final project because it forces you to think through your complete methodology of your entire project, sometimes before you have even started it. So it's a really good way to think through what you're going to do, but it can take some time to think it out and then diagram it. So be sure to leave yourself sufficient time for this. Now, I'm going to show you a few examples in just a second, but a couple points before we go there. The first is that your flowchart has to include inputs, processes, and outputs. So inputs are data layers, processes are some sort of tool in GIS that you're applying to the data, and then the output is the data set that results from that process. So every time you have an input and a process, you must have an output. You shouldn't go from input to process and then straight to another process. There has to be some sort of output data set. The second thing to keep in mind as you're building your flowchart is that you must use tools and techniques from this class. So it's perfectly fine to bring in skills that you learned in, say, GIS 211, but you want to be featuring the skills that you're learning in this class, like hotspot analyses, site suitability analyses, those sorts of things. And the third point here is that if you plan to just kind of make a few maps with your data and then look at them and come to a consensus on whether or not it answers your question, that won't satisfy the project requirement. You have to be using spatial analyses to answer that question, again, with the tools and techniques from this class. So let's take a look at a few examples of flowcharts. This is an excellent example here. I know that it may be a little bit difficult to read everything in the little circles and squares, but what I want you to focus on is the organization and the use of the different colors and symbols to signify inputs, processes, and outputs. So this person chose to use blue circles as their data inputs. So every blue circle is one of their starting data layers. The yellow rectangles are the processes that were applied to the data. And the peach colored circles are the outputs. Now, sometimes they have green circles, which signify intermediate outputs. So outputs that kind of were created along the way as part of the process. And then at the very end here, you can see that they have gray colored circles for the final product outputs. So in this case, there's sort of two different flows of analyses, likely from two different questions that were part of their project. So if you have two questions, you're probably going to have two flows, or at least one flow that breaks off into two parts somewhere. But it's very clear to follow. Every input has a process, every process has an output, and then in a lot of cases that output becomes the input for the next process. So this is an example of an excellent flowchart here. Now this flowchart here is also pretty good. It has the input data layers in the blue circles, and it has the processes in the yellow squares, and then those processes result in green outputs. The one thing that this flowchart could improve on are these hanging outputs. So you can see here that sometimes a process leads to an output that's never the input. And in this case, there's several different outputs here that aren't leading into anything. So it's possible that this person had a bunch of different questions, but more likely they're just not connecting the dots at the end or connecting the pieces at the very end to show how everything fits together to answer the question. Now, this flowchart here is a bit harder to follow. So there's a lot of different colors and shapes happening here, and it's never really clear what those colors and shapes mean because there's no accompanying legend. You can see here that some of the inputs are over here in the red squares, and those seem to be going into these yellow diamond shapes, which are processes. But then there's processes that are heading right into other processes without output data layers. The other aspect of this flowchart that is not going to earn you full points is simply putting something here like a big box that says analyze. You want to be very clear in how you are analyzing your data, what tools you're going to use, what GIS tools you're going to use, and be as specific as possible. So really give a lot of detail in your flowchart. Think of it that if someone else picked up your flowchart and they had your input data, that they would be able to complete your entire analysis and get the same result that you got. So as you begin work on flowcharts for next week, keep in mind that every single step that you perform needs to be reflected in your flowchart, including projecting your data or converting a table of, say, crime points into an actual location and shapefile. So every single step should be reflected. Make sure it's very clear what the inputs are, what the processes are, and what the outputs are. And be sure that your outputs are all coming together to answer the question that you have posed. Take your time with these. They do take a while because, again, you're thinking through the entire process, sometimes before you have actually started playing around with the data. And then simply make sure that your flowchart is clear, and again, that someone else could follow it to recreate your entire analysis. So leave yourself plenty of time for this assignment, and as always, reach out if you have any questions. Take care.